Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to our monthly Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice webinar, where we focus on topics of diversity, equity and inclusion, humanity, and belonging. We bring hard-hitting topics to you that are important for us as a society to acknowledge or to debunk myths, or simply to better understand these topics and address them in a solution-oriented way. I'm Dee Zenobia Swift, Chief Empowerment Officer of Premier Organizational Design, and I am glad you joined us for this month's disruptive discussion. Today, at the center of our topic is the racial wealth gap, and we're going to uncover a few factors that have led to this gap, as well as one specific area in which we hope to bring or help to close or minimize the gap. But first, I have two industry colleagues with me today that are joining us for this discussion. Both are community advocates in their own right and are looking specifically at ways to help minimize the racial wealth gap with a focus on home ownership. So to kick it off, I want you to meet both of these dynamic women, Susan and Nicole. They are not just problem solving, but they are focusing on problem doing, putting ideas into action. But I don't want to do an injustice to who they are, so I'd like to ask them both to introduce themselves. Susan, let's start with you.
Yes, thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. My name is Susan Russell, and I'm a retired marketing and branding professional. I had my own company in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 20 years. But the reason I'm here today is because of my membership in the Arlington Community Church, which is a United Church of Christ organization, and our founding of a Black Wealth Builders Fund during the Lenten season this last year. And we were able to do this thanks to contributions not only from our church, but from other churches and community members. And we had hoped to raise about $50,000 to support Black homeownership. The fund now stands at $170,000, and we have another $50,000 coming from the California Association of Realtors.
Excellent.
So we're very, very happy with the success of the fund, and I'm just very happy for this community support.
Thank you so much, Susan. And we're going to let you talk about the fund and how it came about, and just ways that other people can support you as well. All right, Nicole, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning, Darylyn. My name is Nicole Ennix, and I'm the READY Director for Chdc. READY stands for Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Most of my career, I've been in affordable housing, mainly on the development side. But over the years, I noticed that there was a lot of discrimination and inequity in affordable housing. And so this new role I have at CHDC enables me to do something about it. We have an initiative called the Black Wealth Initiative, which I'll talk more about later on. But it's an initiative to encourage and help Black people to own a home. So we both use education and also funding for down payment assistance and closing costs as a way of encouraging that home ownership.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. And of course, we'll talk more about your initiative as well. We also have two people from my team in the background, Megan, who is our technical genius, and Carla, our learning and development manager, who's going to be monitoring the chat box. So please, let's have a party in the chat box. Go ahead, drop your comments, your questions, your thoughts in there, and we'll make sure to carve out some time on the back end to answer some questions, or if there's a burning question, Carla will let us know that we need to jump in and talk about that burning question. But let's jump right into our topic for today. So given the importance of wealth and the persistence of racial inequity in the US, economists have had a longstanding interest in the racial wealth gap. So this is not a topic that is new. There's been renewed interest, but it's not a topic that is new. So a focus on economic research has been an understanding of which factors contribute to the racial wealth gap and by how much, because we know it's not just one single factor that impacts racial wealth gap. After the webinar, we're going to send all participants a 4-minute video that's going to help to explain many factors and how large this racial wealth gap really is, which is actually in the trillions. So make sure we have your email address. If we don't have it, go ahead and drop it in the chat box so that we have it, so that we can send you the 4-minute video on the back end of this webinar. Now, what we know is that the current racial wealth gap is the consequence of many decades of racial inequities that impose barriers to wealth accumulation. It was intentional, either through explicit prohibition during slavery or unequal treatment after emancipation. So examples of post-emancipation barriers that also drive a trickle-down impact on building wealth or providing robust education and other areas of growth include legally mandated segregation in schools and in housing, and then also discrimination in the labor market. And statistics show that these things still exist. Even redlining, it continues to happen today, but in new ways. And all of these factors and more have reduced access to capital in Black neighborhoods. And most of the studies of the persistent wealth gap between specifically whites and Blacks have investigated the large gap in income earned by both these groups. However, studies by economists generally concluded that the wealth gap was too big to only be explained by differences in income. So if it's more than earnings alone, which yes, the income gap is one of the primary drivers behind the wealth gap, but we have to ask, and Susan and Nicole, I'm going to ask this question of you, and I'd like to get both of your thoughts. What are some of the other social systems or historical conditions that have caused the racial wealth gap? Nicole, let's start with you.
Okay. So I think there's so many different reasons that we could talk about. I'll talk about a few of the larger reasons why there is a gap. First of all, slavery. I think if you have ancestors who were slaves, my great-great-grandmother was a slave. So that's only 4 generations ago. And so if you have ancestors that were not allowed to read or write as a practice, were not allowed to be educated, were not allowed basic freedoms, then you're going to have a major gap between someone whose ancestors were engineers or doctors, because, like I said, slavery is a major factor. The second thing I would say is discrimination well, let me put it like this. Discrimination against African Americans in land ownership. So some of you may know about Bruce Beach, which is a stretch of beach in Manhattan Beach in Los Angeles. And that land was owned by African Americans. It was taken away from them because whites in the area didn't like the fact that they owned the land and that they were making use of the land. I think they had a hotel on the land, etc. So only recently that land was returned to the Bruce family. But can you imagine over the last 100 years, if the Bruce family had that land and could utilize that land and pull money out of that land to educate their families, to send their families to school, to start businesses, etc. And Bruce Beach is not an isolated incident. The Bruce Beaches happened all over the country on numerous occasions. So I would say that definitely had an impact. And then finally, I'll say the criminal justice system. Men make more than women. That's just a fact. It's a sad fact, but it is a fact. And if a high percentage of African Americans are being railroaded through the criminal justice system and ending up in prison, then you have a whole generation of families and men that don't have the benefit of a man in the household, and that definitely contributes. And then lastly, I think generational wealth. African Americans don't typically have generational wealth for just the reasons that I just explained. And if you are a person that has ancestors that had homes or businesses or other assets that could be handed down, you're going to be farther ahead than a group of people who didn't have that benefit. And so I would say that the lack of generational wealth, the lack of ability to provide generational wealth is definitely a factor.
Thank you. That's a lot of information to really just take in and soak in. And you've shared some information that people probably are not aware about, especially with Bruce Beach. Susan, let's get your perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate everything Nicole said. The only thing I can really add is information about all the barriers to home ownership in particular. The government, for example, Black people couldn't qualify for the GI Bill, for example, after the Second World War. You couldn't get an FHA loan if you were Black. So many doors were open for white people that were never open for Black people for, generations. And to Nicole's point about generational wealth, that's how most of us accumulate generational wealth, is through our homes. And that's how we're able to pass wealth from our parents to our kids and to their kids. And if you don't get that head start, then that chain never happens. And it's just very hard to dig out from that.
Right. So we've talked about a lot of cumulative events. It's not just been a single event that occurred or examples that have occurred. And we understand, again, that there is no one reason the racial wealth gap exists. But the irony of this is that America is a nation founded on the idea of individual liberty. And it's also a nation founded on and built up from slave labor. So the dissonance of racial inequity shaped our country in a way that we are still working to, some of us are working to process the inequities, just mentally and emotionally. Some are looking to accept what has happened in the past and how it impacts us today. And some of us are working to correct it. And not having a collective and strategic approach to right the wrongs of which our nation was founded and built has a direct impact on our inability to close the racial wealth gap. Each of you have brought up systems, attitudes, and actions that have impacted the racial wealth gap's continuance to grow, and has kept Black Americans from accessing the same financial resources and opportunities as their white peers or our white brothers and sisters, which they've had access for centuries longer, which directly, again, perpetuates the racial wealth gap. But each of your organizations have taken a specific approach. So I'd like for you to tell me, why are both of your respective organizations focusing specifically on home ownership as a means to build wealth in the Black communities? Susan, let's start with you. Why is your organization focusing on home ownership as a way to build wealth?
Well, I think I personally was very influenced by an article I read in The Atlantic that I'm sure many of you are familiar with by Ta-Nehisi Coates about reparations.
Mhm.
And we at Arlington Community Church, we started an anti-racist group after the murder of George Floyd last summer. And reparations was a topic we often discussed. And when I read that article in The Atlantic, I thought, and he really emphasized the barriers to home ownership and how that has really been one of the main factors that increases the racial wealth gap. So that was in discussion. We were meeting as a group, and we, got more informed about, well, for example, 74% of white people own a home, 44% of Black people own a home. And just like basic statistics, we became familiar with that. And this is a church, it's almost entirely white. And this is a church that does a lot of social justice things already. Like we make sandwiches for the soup kitchen. We do this, we do that. So it's sort of like hands-on activities, which are very important. But we wanted to do something that was structural, something that would get at the core of this racial wealth gap. And so we decided to focus on home ownership because that was the most obvious target. It's also one of the hardest ones to change. It's hard to change neighborhoods, especially in very expensive Bay Area. People don't buy and sell houses very often. So we wanted to start something that was going to have a big effect over time. Mm-hmm. So as I said earlier, we thought, I don't know how interested people are going to be in this. It might be too abstract. It might be too long term, but people really, really got on board. And I think a lot of it is, you can read books and you can have panels and that's all great, but you can also write a check, and you can do something very specific to help this problem.
Yeah, and you are a great example of this. The fact that your initial goal was $50,000 and you all are at $170,000, that speaks volumes. And I think that, people understand that, money is power. And even if we can't do something on a larger scale immediately, which we can through time and collective action, people doing their part. Everyone doing their part a little bit by a little bit actually goes a long way. So I'm really thankful for you and the Black Wealth Builders Fund and Arlington Church and what you all have done. Nicole, what about you? What is Community Housing Development Corporation doing?
So Community Housing Development Corporation has created the Black Wealth Initiative. And I think it was created a couple of reasons. CHDC is a Black-led organization. And so we felt like we had a responsibility to help in this area. When we heard statistics like for every $100 of assets that a white family has, a Black family has $6 of assets. And that 75% of white families own homes as compared to 44% of Black families. Seeing that disparity and being in the business of housing and knowing that housing is a major source of wealth for most American families, probably the largest, most valuable asset that most families have. And we realized that we needed to bridge the gap, but also that we could use the experience that we had in the housing market and helping people to buy their first homes. CHDC has a 30-year history of both developing affordable housing and also helping individuals or families buy their first homes. And so we had already been encouraging home ownership on a larger scale for mainly low income families or moderate income families. But for the BWI, the Black Wealth Initiative, we decided that we needed to just focus our efforts a little bit more on the Black community to help bridge that gap.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And, many of you listening may have seen or heard of stories about the Fair Housing Act being signed more than, I think it's 53 years ago in April of 1968. which outlawed housing discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. But I was shocked when I stumbled upon some US Census data that showed that the percentage of US Blacks, Black Americans who own their own home today is essentially the same as when housing discrimination was outlawed in 1968. So in 1970, the census found that 42% of Black households own their own home. The first quarter of this year in 2021, both Susan and Nicole mentioned the number was around 44%. Actually, it was 44.6%. So I'd like to ask you both, why should this matter? The fact that we're essentially in the same place as we were 53 years ago. Why should this matter? Why should this be important to everyone and not just Black Americans? Nicole, what do you think about that?
I would say the best way to define why it should be important, I'm going to read a quote, and this is a quote from a letter that Dr. Martin Luther King wrote from Birmingham jail. And the quote is this: "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." In short, when Black people do better, the whole country does better. Citibank did a study recently that said that if there had been less housing discrimination over the last 20 years, that we might have had 770,000 additional homeowners. That could have contributed over $218 billion to the gross, to the GDP. So, you know, I don't think you can deny that if Black people are doing better, it helps the economy, it helps the job market, it helps everyone do better if we can bring African Americans to the same level that that white Americans are in terms of home ownership.
In terms of home ownership and other factors, but specifically we're talking about home ownership. Susan, what are your thoughts?
I would just like to say the removal of the legal barriers to housing ownership in 1968, the Fair Housing Law, it wasn't enough. Just simply saying, oh, no, don't do that is not enough. You have to have active programs, active outreach, active educational programs about how you buy a house, what the path is. And then people's attitudes have to change. I mean, you know, which goes first, the law or the attitude? And the law definitely helps, but the attitude has to change as well. And then there's things like zoning laws that have taken decades to change. And, you know, California just finally introduced something to allow more multifamily homes on lots that had been zoned for single family. And Berkeley's one of the worst examples of a redlined city in the country, and people think of it as very progressive. So I think the Fair Housing Law was a necessity, but it just wasn't enough to get people where they needed to go. And following Nicole's lead, I'm going to read a quote from the Realtors Association that says, "Here's why people need to own homes. Homeownership boosts the educational performance of children, induces higher participation in civic and volunteering activity, improves healthcare outcomes, and lowers crime rates." So why wouldn't you want more people to own homes if those are the benefits?
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because even though we're talking about home ownership, people don't always realize there's a trickle down effect, right? So you talked about home ownership has an impact on education, even to the point of if Black Americans are always able to buy homes in lower income neighborhoods, the tax rate is lower, which means that the money that's going into the schools is going to be lower, right, than the money that's going into some higher income, higher appraised neighborhoods. So it's going to impact our education system. It's going to impact our healthcare system. And as you said, lower crime rates occur. So there's more than just home ownership at stake here. So I thank you for bringing that up. And Susan, I also wanted to mention that what I love about what you all are doing is as a faith-based organization, you all have decided that this is definitely an area that you want to put not just your money, but also some action behind. And I think it's really important to highlight that and to just thank you and Arlington Church and the other East Bay organizations who have decided that this is something that you want to tackle in terms of closing the racial wealth gap. So thank you for that. Also, Nicole, on the opposite side is the inventory of homes and identifying people who can benefit from the funds that are being raised towards home ownership in the BIPOC communities. Why is that important for your organization and Community Housing Development Corporation? Why is it important for them to focus on closing the racial wealth gap? And what are the programs, activities, or initiatives you all are engaging in to do?
I think once again, because CHDC is a Black-led organization, we felt a special connection to this particular issue and solving the racial wealth gap. For years, we have tried to help low-income and minority homeowners purchase a home or rent a home in a safe place. Safety, having a safe home, a safe place to live, a safe place to raise your kids and lay your head has always been top priority for us. And so this disparity in racial wealth just emphasize that fact that we had to do something. We created the Black Wealth Initiative, which we raise money from individuals and organizations. Arlington Church is one of the organizations who we have partnered with, and they have decided to contribute some of their funds toward our Black Wealth Initiative, and other organizations in the community, such as the 12 Days of Christmas, which is a nonprofit here in the Bay Area, and also some individuals. What was the name of the other church that provided us funds? There were around $10,000 that they provided, but you know, a large group of people contributed funds to this project, and the more funding that we can get, the more people we can help. And so we are determined to advertise our program, to get participants in the program to participate, and also get members of the community to donate their time and money to this project. And today's kickoff is the beginning of that effort.
So today is the official kickoff for the Black Wealth Initiative. So I'm glad you highlighted that. But I want to go back for just a minute. And, you know, I've been working with CHDC on putting together the structure of the Black Wealth Initiative. And what's been amazing to me is the number of people and faith-based organizations as well. We have the Mission Unitarian Church in, I think it's in Fremont.
Yes, that's the one that I was trying.
Yeah, and one of their members was very instrumental in helping us determine how to structure different components of the Black Wealth Initiative, and we've been very appreciative. And they've raised a good amount of money as well. And then there are banks and other types of organizations who have said, let's step in, because, you know, we want to make sure that we're showing our support and we're not just saying that we're supportive and we understand the problem, but that again, that we're doing. So Susan, I wanna go back, and is there anything you want to tell everybody about the Black Wealth Builders Fund that will help them to understand not necessarily the why, but the process that you all went through to create the fund?
Yes, it was like sort of any classic fundraising project. We started small with our own church, and we started with the group that had belonged to the anti-racist discussion group that we had after the murder of George Floyd. And then we started to evangelize it, for lack of a better word, throughout the rest of the church, and sort of get people on board and start to explain. And one thing about raising money is you get to get money, but you also get to educate. And so we were able to say, this is a huge problem. Here's some numbers about rates of Black ownership. This is huge. This is something you can do to help with this. And so we started small in our own community. But the United Church of Christ in particular has a good record for racial equity issues. And so then we began to reach out to other churches, First Congregational Church in Berkeley, the Unitarians, in fact, in Kensington, and a number of other churches. So we were able to kind of spread the word that way. But the biggest help to us was Lent, because our church, and I know many churches also have a special offering for Lent. Another excuse, to go out and ask for money, but also to educate. And we made some videos discussing why we started this and why it's important. And so the word sort of spread that way. But I'm really surprised by how much people really wanted to participate. And I think people want to do something and they often don't know what to do. Exactly. And so this was, I have an idea, write a check.
Right. And I remember, because we had a webinar in July, and it was a grand opening actually of one of our affordable housing communities in North Richmond, California. And in that webinar, we asked Barry from our church in the East Bay to come and talk to us. And one thing that he said that really stood out to me, because I personally, I do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I stay very sensitive about different people's perspective, trying to understand different people's perspective. He said that from a white person's perspective, that it wasn't just being good people, but that the country was built off the blood and backbone of our Black brothers and sisters, and this is just the right thing to do. He mentioned that, in lack of government reparations, that this was just the right thing to do. And I really appreciated that coming from somebody other than another Black American, because of course we have our lived experiences, but it's important for others to recognize and not to refute or say, it's not that bad, it didn't happen, but to recognize and accept it and try to understand that, and then think, what can we do to help? So I really appreciated that. Now, we've talked about some of the historical discriminatory factors that have contributed, and some people still don't connect with the inequities. Susan, what would you say to them? And then Nicole, I'll ask you next. What would you say to them to help them understand just how critical this is, and how the inequities or inequitable actions have really negatively impacted Black Americans?
Well, I guess, you can talk sort of based on what Barry was saying to your organization earlier about what it means to be a good person and what it means to be a good citizen. But I would like to sort of build again on Ta-Nehisi Coates' work. And I have a quote that I drew from his 2014 article in The Atlantic. And it's a call to patriotism. Which I thought was sort of an interesting angle. It's like, okay, let's try to be better people, and let's try to follow Jesus. Let's try to do these things. But what if we saw this whole initiative as a way to build a better America? And sometimes that appeals to people when nothing else will. So I'll read this short quote.
Okay.
An America that asks what it owes its most vulnerable citizens is improved and humane. An America that looks away is ignoring not just the sins of the past, but the sins of the present and the certain sins of the future. More important than any single check cut to any African American, the payment of reparations would represent America's maturation out of the childhood myth of its innocence into a wisdom worthy of its founders.
I love that. That's powerful. Those are powerful words. And the thought of building a better America. I've never really looked at it from that standpoint. And when you think of it from that standpoint, maybe it can help people to see this is the collective activity that has to happen. Nicole, yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I like that quote. Nicole, what are your thoughts?
I think for CHDC, there's a lot of, I guess, self-determination in our efforts to want to help. It's all fine and well to have organizations of every background and color to want to help. I think that's important, and there's no way that this effort can be successful without it. But there's something about helping your own that has a special meaning to CHDC. And so all I can say is that if not now, then when? If not you, then who? And so I think it is important for everybody to remember that they can make a difference. And it's often difficult with all this discussion of racial inequities of, well, how do I help? You know, how do I make a difference? But the Black Wealth Initiative is a way to really make a difference, and you can see the difference. You can see that your funds or that you donate can help a family to get into a home. And right now we're doing a Home for Christmas campaign, and the campaign is called Home for Christmas because obviously at Christmas time, you know, people want to have somewhere where they can gather. They want to have somewhere where they can be with their family and, you know, have the traditional Thanksgiving, Christmas, or holiday events. And so we're really trying to engage people during this holiday time, this time of giving, to encourage them to give money so that maybe a Black family will be able to have a home for Christmas.
Okay, I like that, the home for Christmas or the holidays. So I want to highlight, we've talked today about two different initiatives that work in sync for the same reason of trying to do their part to close or help minimize the racial wealth gap through home ownership. We've talked a lot about historical reasons that gap exists and why home ownership is an important part of moving to minimize that gap. So again, I just want to be very, I am very appreciative of both Susan and Nicole and your respective organizations. So I want to thank you. You've been very enlightening and informative. And I hope that people, and later on after we take some questions, I hope that people that joined us today will spread the word about both of your initiatives. And we're going to put up some contact information in a minute. But let's see, Carla, do we have any questions for our panelists today?
Yes, in fact, yeah, we do, Dee, thanks. So we have just two questions. The first was from Rosa, and it was, does CHDC work with HUD funding?
Yes. Could the person expound on what specific type of funding, because that would help me to answer the question, or just HUD funding in general.
She just mentioned a HUD funding in general.
Okay, then yes, we do work with HUD funding. We work with when we're looking at the best loan programs for the first-time home buyers. We look at a variety of different funds, and so the Black Wealth Initiative is one fund, but we layer that on top of other funds that would be beneficial to the home buyer, and HUD is definitely one of those providers.
Okay, great. And the second question was from Kurt. He asked, how is CHDC helping BIPOC people get ready for home ownership?
We have quite a few educational programs that help homeowners learn what is required to purchase a home. So first we assess what your credit is, what your debt situation is, how, if you need to do any work in those two areas to improve your debt to debt ratio. And I think basically we hold the home buyer's hand in terms of any questions that they may have about the home buying process, any setbacks that that they have. We help them to not get frustrated and to get past those so that they can get to the point of being able to own a home. And that's, again, with education, with workshops, which cover a variety of topics, and also with funding for the down payment.
Great. Are those all the questions?
Actually, one just jumped in for Susan. So the question was, after your church or your organization raises funds, how do they get those funds directly into the community?
Yes, we set up a donor advised fund at the Richmond Community Foundation to house the money. And this is a foundation that has a great track record with affordable housing in the Contra Costa County in particular, but the Bay Area in general. So we put the money there. Then we're working with CDHC and other organizations who have educational programs like the one Nicole was describing that will keep people on track so that all the steps have been taken for them to be qualified. So in other words, we work through organizations to get the money out to the community versus loaning money to individuals, because there's a lot that goes into home ownership, as anybody who's ever tried to buy a house will know. And we want to be sure that we're setting people up for success.
And I think that's really important, and important to highlight. And I like what Kurt that asked that question? I like that they asked the question about what else are we doing to get people ready. So the educational piece is very important, because you can give people money just to get into a home, but if you don't teach them right financial habits, financial literacy, if you don't teach them how to prevent foreclosure, if you don't teach them savings and budgeting, then you're not giving them the tools to be successful. So I like that that's an important part of this effort. So I know I'm looking at the time, we're running out of time, so I want to wrap this up, but I want to reiterate a few things first. You might already be aware that there is a significant wage gap as well. We've talked about home ownership, but there's also a significant wage gap between Black and white Americans. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that last year, Black men's median earnings, I think it was around 75% of white men's median earnings, which impacts home ownership. And Black women earned 85% of what white women earned, which impacts home ownership. The wage disparity is real, but it isn't the only factor that contributes to the racial wealth gap. We must also look at the asset gap, and that's where home ownership comes in. That's where the Black Wealth Builders Fund and the Black Wealth Initiative, that's where they come in. And it's important for us to look at these along with consumption and stock ownership. Home ownership is a leading driver in this wealth gap disparity. And the gap between Black and white homeowners rates is the highest it's been in 50 years. And both Susan and Nicole talked about what those different percentages are. So with this racial wealth gap, which began with slavery, where Black laborers worked for more than 2 centuries for zero compensation, and even after emancipation, received no payment for those generations of slave labor. It's important for us to note that this is not a Black people's problem. It's an American societal and governmental problem. And so when Susan said or read the quote that talked about building a better America, I think that fits into it is all of our problems. We can't wait for reparations or for assistance from a body that has had more than a century to acknowledge and address its oppressions. So we ask that you stand with these 2 organizations and support them as as we act to deliberately and systematically encourage Black Americans in their efforts to build wealth. So we thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us in November, which is going to be our last webinar of 2021. We're not going to have a webinar in December. We're going to take a little break, but we'll pick back up in January of 2022. Our November webinar will be the last Tuesday of November, and we're going to talk about, are you an ally or are you a bystander? And 5 ways to level up your ally game. So thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in November and appreciate you joining us once again for October's disruptive discussion. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thank you.